Oil shocks. We've had a few over the years, typically associated with supply. But any student of economics will tell you, supply is only half the story. You've also got demand. And that has changed a lot since the 1973 oil shock sent US pump prices soaring. In fact, we've gone from worrying about when oil supplies will run out to wondering when demand for oil will peak. The answer to that question will determine where trillions of dollars of investment will be spent over the decades to come, and have profound implications for the health of our planet and the geopolitics that shape it. So this week on Reuters Econ World, we're looking at peak oil. It's what we do here on the pod. Every week, we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins in Dublin. In 1956, a geologist for Shell, a man by the name of M. King Hubert, famously predicted that US oil and gas production would peak in the 1970s and then decline. His prediction spawned the popular theory known as peak oil. And for decades, his prediction appeared to be accurate, until it wasn't. Why? Because supply shocks in the 1970s sent prices surging. And when you have a supply problem, demand responds. Consumers look around for alternatives, whether that be coal or nuclear, or in more recent times, biofuels, solar and wind. And they become more efficient in how they use oil. High prices also attract new supply. Think of the shale revolution that turned the US into the world's largest oil producer in little more than a decade. And new information changes things. We now know that oil is one of the largest contributors to climate change, and we've vowed to transition away from it. So when will demand for oil peak? And who will be the winners and losers? I'm delighted today to have Simon Webb, Reuters Global Commodities and Energy Editor, to talk all this through. Simon, welcome to the pod.
Thank you very much, Carmel. It's great to be here.
So you've seen up close then the transition from concerns about peak oil supply to concerns about peak oil demand.
Yep, absolutely. Back in 2007, 2008, there was a lot of talk about not enough investment in energy, not enough investment in oil, and the possibility of peak supply topping out and there not being any more. I mean, some of the big oil producers scoffed at that, but, there were concerns there wouldn't be more supply from Saudi and others. Since then, we've had the shale revolution, and now there's concern about when we meet peak oil demand, and a lot of polemic about it too.
So I'm looking forward to getting into that later in the show, but could you first maybe take us back to 1973 and explain to listeners what happened and why it was such a big deal for the oil markets?
I can try take you back there. I was 2 at the time, so don't have any fresh memories.
Surely not born, Simon. Surely not born.
I mean, I suppose 73 was the shock that stayed in the minds of consumers. That's what's important about it.
Yeah.
What happened then was, in response to the US support for Israel during the Arab-Israeli war at the time, OPEC producers, basically led by the Arab members, imposed an embargo on exports to the States. And that caused severe energy shortages, long lines, petrol stations, and really sort of brought to the forefront of policymakers' minds energy security, energy supply security, and what that means. Who do you want to be relying on for your oil?
Yeah.
It didn't change things that much in the great scheme of things, right? The US ended up as reliant, if not more reliant, on some of the producers in the Middle East that had been involved in the Arab oil embargo and developed very close relations with them. And that worked over time.
Mm-hmm.
But it did cause a shock for policymakers and did result in them having a real think about where their energy supplies come from, what constitutes security of supply. And that came back to the forefront of policymakers' minds, I think, after the war in Ukraine started and we saw sanctions imposed on Russian oil imports into Europe and the States and other industrialized countries that put in question like 10% of global supplies and strained those supply lines. So it has been at the forefront of policymakers' minds again.
You mentioned there Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it does seem like the market gets less exercise today about these kind of supply shocks than it did, say, back in the 70s. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think a lot of that is because there's not a sense of shortage of supply in the markets, right? The Middle East conflict hasn't actually impacted supply that much, right? Because the big fear with the conflict there is that bigger producers get dragged into it, but they haven't so far.
Yeah.
The attacks in the Red Sea have disrupted supply chains and led to some oil cargoes having to take longer routes to get to refineries or to get to consumers.
Mm-hmm.
But we haven't really seen that. We have not seen a shortage of supply. We have big increases in US production over the past few years. It's been going on for longer than that with the shale oil revolution, but the last few years, they've sort of outstripped forecasts. Places like Guyana have seen a rapid rise in production too. So
yeah,
if oil markets aren't tight, then they are less susceptible to these potential disruptions in supply. And that's what we've seen, really. I mean, Brent crude's at $75 a barrel, which is probably not low for consumers, but not high either for producers. And just 2 weeks ago, it was down below $70 a barrel. And that was the lowest since 2021.
So if supply is abundant, is demand the issue?
It's partly because of that, right? There's the sort of ups and downs of the global economy, which is perennial, right? And this year we've seen the debate about high interest rates, what the impact is going to be on the economy, whether or not we're going to soft landing.
Mm-hmm.
But below it, underneath it all, there's a structural change. And that is to do with consumption of transport fuels, right? That has changed the picture because demand is not as strong as many forecasters expected it to be this year. And that's played a part in these weak prices.
Okay.
So where we're seeing that, particularly, I think the focus for a lot of analysts looking at the oil market has been what's happening with China and Chinese demand, right?
Right.
And the reason for the change is the rapid rise in sales of electric vehicles.
Okay, so, and well, let's get into that. Where are we in terms of forecasts around peak oil demand?
Yeah, we're all over the place is where we are. I don't think there's any doubt there's a structural change happening, right?
Okay.
The energy transition, the policies that, many governments have brought into place around the world, the fact that many car makers at one point or another have said that they would stop making internal combustion engines. I mean, the biggest driver of global oil demand is and has been for decades gasoline, right?
Right.
So if you're not using as much gasoline, you're not going to see as much oil demand growth. That's, so that structural change is happening. What it actually means when we see peak oil demand really depends on who you ask, right?
Yeah.
If you ask the International Energy Agency, which is kind of like the West's energy watchdog, represents many of the biggest consumers and advises them on oil policy, well, they say peak oil demand is going to come in 2029, there or thereabouts.
Right, this decade.
Yeah. So, not far off at all, 5 years. And you could be looking at the peak year for oil consumption. If you ask OPEC, you could see oil demand growing way out till 2050. BP said next year.
Oh.
So it's all over the place. And it's really important, right? Because this is like one of the world's biggest industries. This is something that we all need, the economy needs, and you need to plan for it. It takes years to bring online the projects that supply us with oil every day. It's 102 million barrels a day at the moment and requires trillions and trillions of dollars. And if you can't figure out when peak demand's going to be, it's very difficult for not just for OPEC Plus, but for big oil companies too, to plan for that and for consumer governments.
How big a role does China play in all of this?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, the one that's really kind of caught the market a little bit on the hop this year, has been the speed at which China's rolling out electric vehicles.
Yeah.
China's got to the point now where it's almost at 50%, there or thereabouts, of electric vehicle sales and hybrid sales. And it's so important with China because China for many years now has been the main driver of global oil demand growth.
Right.
Like year in, year out, for over a decade, it's been 500,000 barrels a day, 600,000 barrels a day per year additional oil demand.
Wow.
And it's way and above demand growth from any other country. And this year, the forecasts have been coming down steadily all year. And I think the IEA's latest forecast is 180,000, 190,000 barrels a day.
Okay. Whoa.
Much, much, much smaller than it's been historically.
Huge drop from about 500,000.
Exactly. Huge drop from 500 to 600,000 barrels per day average there's been over the past 10 years. Now, there have been spikes within that, right? But that's your average. It's much, much lower.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to do with EVs. New vehicles are replacing the older, less efficient vehicles, and they're not using any gasoline, or they're using much less if they're hybrids. And it's China that's leading it, but it's happening everywhere. And outside of China, we're also seeing new vehicles are far more efficient than old vehicles, right? And so the US is driving more miles than it ever has, but using like 4 or 5% less gasoline than it did in, say, 2019 to do it.
How much oil demand could the adoption of EVs, the mass adoption of EVs, take out?
I mean, there's about 102 million barrels a day of oil demand at the moment, somewhere between 102 million, 103 million barrels a day. And the IEA forecasts that electric vehicles could displace 6 million barrels per day of gasoline and diesel demand by 2030. So it's effectively 6% of supply. And that's by 2030. So again, not very far off.
But yet, as you say, we're all over the place when it comes to predictions for peak oil.
Part of the reason for those differences, Carmel, is because those inform policymakers, right?
Yeah.
So if you're OPEC, you don't want policymakers thinking, peak oil's just around the corner, because then they start thinking about what they need to do to prepare for peak oil demand. Whereas if you say, it's off in 2050, then it becomes less urgent. It becomes less of an issue in policy. Language at COP.
Yeah.
UN climate conference, right? There's always a fight about language in the final statement. Whether you talk about phasing down, phasing out, whatever you could call it, coal and then oil. That's where the fight goes, right? That's what it comes down to. Who's going to have influence over language like that subsequently influences government policy around the world? So that's why it's so polemic, right? Like when peak oil is going to be, how much investment needs to happen in new oil and gas projects in order to meet demand. All of that depends on what your view is of when peak oil is going to happen.
Not all consumers are seeing the benefit of cheaper oil prices.
Since yesterday morning, we have been here and we couldn't get fuel. And now the government have increased the price of fuel. How do they want us to cope?
That's Martins Dominic, a businessman in Lagos, angry about a hike in prices. Nigeria is Africa's biggest oil producer, but spends billions of dollars every year importing gasoline, or petrol as it's known locally, because until recently, it didn't have any capacity to refine its own. The start of petrol production at a new refinery this month has spurred the government to move towards ending subsidies that kept petrol cheap. MacDonald Zerotwe is Reuters bureau chief in Nigeria.
In this month, September, the state oil company NNPC increased the price twice in a space of 1 week. That was by a minimum of around 50% in total. Now, that caused a lot of anger in this country because petrol is basically the lifeblood of Nigeria. Majority of Nigerians actually do not have grid electricity. That's where petrol now comes in because people here, small businesses, they use petrol to run their generators to produce electricity. So when you increase the price of petrol, you're not only impacting transport costs, you're basically impacting the way Nigerians can, it will decide whether a Nigerian citizen can have electricity or not. That's why it's so important for Nigerians. It's a touchy subject. Nigeria spends 40% of its forex on importing these petroleum products. So the government's long-term plan is to completely rid the country of subsidies, petrol subsidies, because they say it is taking away, resources that are supposed to be put into schools, into hospitals, into agriculture.
So Simon, how is OPEC handling the possibility of peak oil?
Well, OPEC Plus is facing a bit of a dilemma. OPEC Plus is OPEC and its allies because it's not just OPEC, right? The allies are led by Russia.
Yeah.
They have deep cuts in place, nearly 6 million barrels per day off the market. They were going to start bringing some of that back from October, and they couldn't right? They decided not to, and it's partly because demand hasn't been as strong as they and others forecast. OPEC Plus doesn't believe that peak oil demand is just around the corner. So they believe that it's way off. They just put a report out saying that it'll be growing steadily through 2050. If that forecast is accurate, they will have an opportunity to put more oil back on the market. If, however, the IEA and others that say peak oil demand's just around the corner are correct, then either they will need to take more oil off the market to balance supply and demand, or fight for market share. They always face this dilemma because whenever they take oil off the market, they push prices up, and that helps producers that don't take oil off the market to try and balance supply and demand. But it gets worse if you start thinking about oil demand eroding, right? Then the gap gets worse. And for many countries in OPEC Plus, this is their primary export. It's their primary revenue stream, right? It's an existential issue. At what point then do they say, well, we can't take any more oil off the market, right? Demand's falling for this stuff and we need to sell it. That question is, when do they start a price war effectively? They would have to knock out supply from their competitors to make space for their oil. In that scenario, we're not there yet, right? And as I say, there's a lot of polemic about when that might be. But then you're into a last company standing kind of scenario in the end, right? It's way, way off. And everyone thinks that oil demand's going to plateau for some time, even after it peaks. And it won't be a rapid decline. So we're a way off. But Saudi Arabia, for example, put plans to expand its production capacity on hold. And it did mention the energy transition when it did that. They said they would stop plans to increase their production capacity by 1 million barrels per day because it wasn't needed.
If demand changes structurally, it's the more cost-efficient producers that would benefit.
That's right.
And the most cost-efficient producers are the Gulf nations, are your Saudis, your UAEs. So could we see a world where OPEC have an even bigger share of the crude oil market?
That's where it would go if they go into a price war, into a fight for market share, yes. Because they simply are the cheapest producers in the world.
Right.
The problem is they need a lot higher oil price to balance their budgets, right? It's not just about whether they can produce oil for, say, $10 a barrel and sell it for 20. They don't want to be selling it for 20 because it's simply not going to fund their state budgets. And that's the dilemma for them. Right. That's the question. They have to be prepared to absorb some economic pain if they go into a fight for market share.
In the US, where you're based, Simon, the car is king. Fuel costs matter in an election year, but not so much this election year, right?
That's right. And one of the consequences of demand not being perhaps as strong as forecast, with more efficient engines, electric vehicles and hybrids, is that $74, $75 a barrel, the price at the pump in the US is not a factor. And just 2 years ago it was, right? Just 2 years ago, there were stickers on pumps put there by Republican activists saying, I did this, with a picture of Biden pointing at it. So fuel at $3 a gallon is not the political hot potato that it was even 2 years ago in the midterms.
So thinking about that, I mean, is that the future, potentially? The price of oil perhaps playing less of a role in US politics and therefore maybe in geopolitics writ large?
Well, that's another big question, right? I mean, that sort of relies on the assumption that oil prices are going to be low. And I don't think anyone thinks the energy transition is going to be smooth, right? For example, if there's a price war, it could, drive Shell producers or other producers out of business. And then you could very quickly have a big change in fundamentals. That in a way, that's sort of what OPEC Plus would want to happen. That's the only way that they're going to get a bigger market share, right? They knock others out of business. That won't be even. It won't be nice and smooth and go in line with EV sales. You're going to have ups and downs. And so I think most forecasters expect oil prices to be pretty volatile.
Simon, do you have an EV?
I do not. No. I have a standard combustion engine car, which is now 8 years old.
Okay.
So, when it comes up for replacement, then I shall move with the times.
Very good. Very good. I have a diesel.
Do you?
Yeah.
Oh, look at you.
Yeah, I've
back in the 90s.
I'm telling you.
Yeah.
I'm awful.
Yeah.
Simon, thank you so much for this conversation.
Anytime.
Thanks again to Simon Webb, McDonald Zero Tway, and everyone who covers energy at Reuters. You can check out their great work on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. There's also a newsletter to accompany this show. You can sign up for it on Reuters.com or the app. Christopher Walljasper was the producer on this show. Sound design, music composition, and engineering on this episode was by Josh Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Jonah Green, David Spencer, and Sharon Reich Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.